Hi, everyone. Welcome back. We're about to start our final panel for the evening before we have our concluding remarks. It's called Assessing Limits. I'd like to invite Cassie Thornton up to the stage to discuss the presentation, Undermining Imaginary Limitations in a Viral Peer-to-Peer Kind of Model.
So I am Cassie Thornton, and I'm an artist, an activist, more and more of an organizer. And I've been working on a project called The Hologram. It's been an idea for maybe 6 years, but since the pandemic, it became a real thriving social practice that anyone can do with a pretty big community online and offline around the world. And I'm going to talk about it more in a second, but first I wanted to talk a little bit about some of what we've learned as we've been doing it in the pandemic. Because I think it's really interesting and it applies to something much bigger than to just this little mutual aid project. So I think when I titled the presentation, I was thinking about imaginary barriers. I want to actually think more about psychic barriers to interdependence. And the whole project is really about creating like long-term health and stability that would help us survive and thrive as the multiple crises come and go that are part of the end of capitalism. And the goal of the project is to try to help people to somehow find like stability and health that would allow them to sort of begin to construct new worlds after capitalism burns up. So what you need to know from what I'm going to talk about first is just that at the beginning of the pandemic, starting in April of 2020, me and a friend, Rita Wallace, housing organizer and youth worker, began to teach online courses about how to practice the hologram. And it has some theoretical stuff. It's got quite a structured protocol alongside it. So there's a lot we taught. We're in our 5th course right now, and each course is about 30 people from around the world in it. And they meet for about 6 weeks every week. And now we have other facilitators also doing it. And so what we've learned in the process has been really interesting. And what I'm going to be talking about will be the result of about, I think we're going to be around 130 to 150 people that have kind of gone through the courses and who have responded to the information I'm sharing right now. So at the beginning, middle, and end of every part of the hologram courses, we do a lot of surveying as a way to kind of understand where people are at and to understand how and if they transform. At the beginning of each course, we ask this question, which has a multiple choice answer. So choose the best description of how you feel when you imagine yourself in the following care-oriented situations. So I'm going to invite all of us that are watching or online or offline to kind of just think this through casually also for yourself. Okay, got it. So the answers that you might come up with, the multiple choice answers are either, I will not do this. It makes me feel anxious and overwhelmed. Makes me worried about the impact on others. It makes me excited and nervous. Makes me hopeful. It's no problem at all, or other. It's hard to see this right now, but for us, so the first question we ask people is, how do you feel when you imagine being the center of attention? How do you feel when you imagine asking for 2 hours of someone's time to focus on you? How do you feel sharing difficult feelings? How do you feel when you imagine sharing difficult feelings with 3 people at once? How do you imagine feeling inviting people into something they don't yet understand? How do you feel when you imagine finding 3 people that you decide to trust? How do you feel when you imagine that you're asked for help from one of your friends? How do you feel when you imagine having a really heavy story that you need to share? How do you feel when you imagine asking 3 people for a commitment to support you for over a year? How do you feel when you imagine making a commitment to do something for yourself regularly for over a year? So we've asked these questions of between 120 and 150 people. Yes. And the results are really, really interesting. And I think our experience has also supported what this data says. And so I'm going to just focus on a few of the pieces of data that we've gathered. I wish we could get rid of this stuff. Can we? So this one says, how do you feel when you imagine asking for 2 hours of someone's time to focus on you? I think what's interesting about this one is obviously the most prominent response is that it worries me about my impact on others. This is one of 2 questions that has people who answered with the dark blue and they say, actually, I will not do this. I will not ask someone for 2 hours of their time to focus on me. You see the red and green, quite prominent, anxious and overwhelmed, and also excited and nervous. And then, I think the counterbalance is this, that we also have a number of people who are answering this question by saying that they are hopeful. How do you feel when you imagine asking for support for a year from 3 people? And granted, this hologram practice is a very structured type of support. So it's not like I'm just asking people to support you in a fluid, never-ending way. We see again that this is a little bit different because we see there is a large amount of people that say that they're anxious and overwhelmed by the idea of asking for support for a year from 3 people. We see that excited and nervous comes up, but this is the largest moment when we have people say that I will not do this. And this is really important. And then this is so interesting because this question is the only question that is led by the light blue. How do you feel when you are asked for help from one of your friends? The main response is it is no problem at all. And so what we've really realized in the whole practice and the project is that actually asking for help is incredibly difficult. And that we've been taught that in so many ways, we're not allowed to. And if we do ask for help, it's because we are broken or weak. And it's just simply a skill to be vulnerable that we completely undervalue. Okay, so just to kind of summarize, because I actually want to explain the project, is that the psychic barriers to interdependence that we have seen as we've been doing lots of organizing around the hologram. It's not anymore about people not having enough time or not having enough energy or not having technology or anything. The main barriers are psychic. And I believe that these psychic barriers are inherited from different parts of colonialism, capitalism, and racism that we all live with. So one of the most common responses we get in our surveys and in our conversations is that I cannot ask for help because I am not sure I have the capacity or skill to give it back. I think this is so fascinating because it relates to not wanting to go into debt. I don't want to receive something which I cannot necessarily pay back. It also relates to the idea and the fact that many, many people are raised and socialized in ways that tell them that they cannot and should not participate in support work. And obviously this pattern happens along racial and gender lines. So many people in our society, white men are a really good example of people that are not always given the chance or supported to believe that they could also support other people, just as the pressure is obviously put on feminized and racialized people more than anyone else. I can't ask for support because I don't deserve it. This is kind of death-defying to hear over and over again. I think there's a sense of guilt and failure. And I think it comes from living and working in an extremely, like a hyper-individualist culture where we believe that we should be able to survive in a set of systems that are literally made to help us fail. And we take personal responsibility for those failures. And so many people feel that they actually do not deserve support. And I would say after doing lots of workshops with people who work in professional care, like we've done workshops with emergency, people that work in the emergency room for the NHS, we've done it with Sisters on Cut, we've done it with all kinds of people on the front lines in various ways in healthcare. The people that actually give support professionally feel most like this, like they don't feel like they deserve support. There is an overwhelming pattern of people believing that they can't ask for support because their story is too heavy, but I think it's unanimous. I actually think that this is such a standard belief. And what happens in this process and this practice that's so positive, so what was it? So almost toxically positive as an experience is that the story actually, when it's held by a number of people at the same time, it becomes very light. It also becomes clear that we all have very heavy stories. And so when next to each other, maybe by comparison or by mass, by scale, the story becomes at least not mine, but ours. And finally, I can't seek support, and we're talking about in a peer-to-peer context, because my friends are already overburdened. And of course they are, and also when most people are asked, at least in our survey and in my life experience, so many people actually really would love to know how they can plug into somebody else's life and be of support. Okay, so the hologram, I would love to know how much time I have so that I can explain it at the right pace.
You have 10 minutes.
Beautiful. Okay, so the hologram is it's quite a structured protocol, a practice that anyone can use. And now it's a pretty big community of people that use it and are trying to make it more accessible to more people. I think the goal is to sort of become something that might be like a viral or cellular structure, something maybe like Alcoholics Anonymous, not in belief system or practice, but just in terms of being something that can be replicated and used by anyone, and hacked and remade. The goal is to create a network of people who can support each other through crisis. And yeah. And and really to undermine a lot of the learnings that we end up internalizing from capitalism. Oh, this was meant to be a animation, but it's not. But the project does start with one person and then it grows virally. And sometime I will show you this very cute animation. But it starts with one person who we call the hologram, and they ask people to support them. I'm going to talk just for 2 seconds about the history of the project because I think it's really important, because the project itself comes from a moment of crisis. So the project is based on the work that was being done at the Social Solidarity Clinic of Betzler, where a group called the Group for Different Medicine decided to try to make not like free and non-hierarchical care. And this was at a moment of financial collapse in Greece that was at the same time as the huge migrant crisis. So the hospitals were not able to meet the needs that were coming to them, and so many doctors and professional health practitioners, as well as anarchists and NGOs and religious people, opened 63 clinics all over Greece. One particular clinic was like, how can we give not only free care, but non-hierarchical care? They worked on a project that was very inspirational to me, and that shaped the hologram. And in this project, the person that came into the clinic was not called a patient, they were called an incomer. They wanted to shake off any idea that a person that was coming in to get care was necessarily broken or sick. The only difference is that they're coming in from the outside. They were seen by a therapist, a social worker, and a doctor. The idea of the meeting is to actually help the incomer to see their entire selves, to be able to see, well, the doctors would ask questions about, like, where do you get your food? They would get a physical exam. Are you lonely? What are your working conditions? Who is your family? To whom do you owe debt? And all of this stuff, as we know very well, make up a person's health. In this project, it just becomes material. And the goal of the project is, by the end of this first meeting, the incomer is invited to actually make a plan with the help of these caretakers. And so the incomer gets to ask for support. The name hologram comes from Rosa Morelli, who is one of the people who instigated this project, a longtime psychologist. And she told me literally that after being a psychologist for decades and decades, when she began to do this project and she could see an incomer, their body, their social life, their food, like to see all of this at the same time, could finally make them into a hologram instead of just a flat piece of paper. So that's where we got the title. So at the time that this project, as I was learning about the Greek, what was happening in the Greek clinics, I was living in California without medical insurance, which is very normal in the United States, but also with really insecure housing and everything, all the stuff. And so was everybody that I knew. And so we were wondering, me and a group of friends, is a different medicine possible for us? Can we do this without experts, without space, without money, without visibility, and when we're all sick? And so our idea was to actually distribute the work that was happening among friends. So we renamed the incomer a hologram, and the hologram invites 3 people to meet with them regularly. One person asks questions about mental and emotional health, one person asks questions about social health, and one person asks questions about physical health. Sounds easy, and yet being curious and being observant is a challenge in itself, as well as actually organizing this kind of support. So the idea would be that these people would meet regularly and maintain their roles. So the hologram is always a hologram, and these 3 people asking questions are always asking questions from these angles. Okay. The project, very importantly, is an endurance art project. The goal is to get people into triangles or organized around holograms for not like a month, but maybe for like 6 years or like the rest of our lives. The goal is to create social infrastructure that really lasts. And by doing this, it means that all the people that participate, the pressure is off. We're not trying to rush to solve problems. It's like slow learning. So the incomer, we now call the hologram. We see the hologram as an expert about their own health. Nobody else knows their story or what it feels like to be in their body. We also see them as a teacher who is showing their triangle, there's 3 supporters, that it is possible to ask for and articulate your needs. And this is so vital, I think right now, for so many reasons. The triangle members are, whether they're professional caretakers or not, they are always curious non-experts. They never give advice. Like the weight is lifted. They're just there to be curious and ask questions. They are critical feelers. The goal is not to try to stop a sinking ship. Like the goal is to just be together and to understand as closely as possible what the conditions and feelings of the hologram are. And they are radically taking this project is so amazing. I mean, we take notes and we make up new languages, and the way that we keep track of, we become each other's living medical records. I think most important is that the project is viral. So reciprocation looks different. The hologram's job is to make sure that the 3 people that support them get support. So it's not returning what you receive, it's making sure that the project continues to grow, and it can grow and change, and every generation can be different. But it's about experimenting with what it's like to separate receiving from giving. This is a really horrible idea from anybody that is interested in gift economies. And if I had more time, I would talk about it a little bit more. But I think the goal of this is to actually create a culture of care instead of a closed loop. And I think this is the big difference between this project and a lot of other sort of care-oriented projects. So the hologram makes sure that their supporters get support, and then their work is to support somebody else. And so the project continues to grow. The protocol is quite structured, and I could explain it to people if they're interested, maybe in the Q&A, but it's been really refined. And the way that it's been really refined, again, is because we have taught these public courses in the middle of the pandemic, in the middle of so many emergencies. A large group of people have really contributed to figuring this out and making it work. And so now it is a very sound structure. We have lots of facilitators trained, and this is a little bit, it's like slightly aged, but now I think we have about 130 or so people that have a triangle that we know of. Yeah, I think that might be, oh, actually, I'm just gonna zoom to this last closing piece. The sort of most important ideas of the project are just simply that this is a project to support anti-capitalist struggle. I mean, this is a project to make people strong so that they can fight for a better and create a better world, whatever that means for them. It's based on the belief that we're a cooperative species, and we just need practice to do that, and just safe ways to practice being what we are. Difference and change are our greatest powers. Healing is difficult. The person who needs help is potentially our most important teacher, and is very powerful. And we can collectively solve our problems without permission or authority. Yep.
Should be very interesting to talk about it later. If I can invite Mark Fabian to join us at the front desk. He'll be presenting a paper called Co-Producing Wellbeing Public Policy.
Right, yeah, thanks for having me. I just want to preface this by saying that I don't know much at all about medical humanities, so I'll just sort of try to describe this project in a broad way, and then from the Q&A, if you guys can see towards the bits that are most interesting for you. Riana says that this would definitely fit in well into this session, so fingers crossed. So this is joint work with Anna Alexandrova, who's in the Department of History and Philosophy of Science here at Cambridge. I'm at the Bennett Institute for Public Policy. So the kind of motivation for this work is that there are a whole bunch of concepts in science, but particularly in public policy, that are very value-laden, that we might call thick concepts. These are concepts that both describe something, so they're amenable to empirical inquiry or empirical engagement, but they also evaluate it. So in order to work with these concepts, you have to make a value judgment. And so a motivating question for us is, well, what is responsible science and responsible policy when you're working with these kind of thick concepts? So in one paper that we have out of this project, it's more in the kind of philosophy of science space, we offer 3 ways that we think are like hopefully exhaustive of the ways to deal with these concepts. And they are as follows. So you can redefine these thick concepts as purely technical terms in a way that you try to get rid of their evaluative tinge. You can, as a scientist, assume full responsibility for making the associated value judgment, or you can try to make the value judgment with political legitimacy, which is quite a complex thing and has a lot of its own subcategories. So we would argue that the third way is preferable for public policy from an ethical point of view, but like you can take it axiomatically in a liberal democracy, but it's quite hard to get right. So in particular, what is legitimacy? Are you talking about electoral approval? Are you talking about the process that you go through? How can you think about that concept? So the model that we propose, which we think is viable in many areas of science and many areas of public policy, is to co-produce measurement, which includes the definition of the concept that you're trying to measure, you co-produce that measurement by balancing 3 sources of expertise, which we call lived expertise, professional expertise, and technical or academic expertise. And you try to do this co-production in a particular context, and that can be quite complicated as well. So the context that I'm going to present on for the rest of the presentation is a theory of thriving for a charity that works with people who are experiencing financial hardship. But there's a lot of examples of this sort of work, at least in the wellbeing policy space, developing theories of wellbeing in different groups, particularly Indigenous groups and people in developing countries who are facing various sorts of marginalisation. So before I get to that quickly, so why don't we think that options 1 and 2 are sort of ideal, at least in policy, but also in science? So just think about that first option of redefining a technical term so that it loses its evaluative tinge. This is pretty common practice in science. So in the wellbeing space, one of the most prominent examples is the field of subjective wellbeing. So you define this as a technical term. You say subjective wellbeing is just what makes people say their life go well. Yeah. And then you don't treat those responses as themselves valuable or that construct as itself valuable. You think that it's just an empirical phenomenon. Of course, then when you take what you come up with in your lab and start to make policy recommendations on that basis, then you seem to really be big time starting to make value judgments, and that's what my kind of first book is about. One of the nice things about this approach is that it, or at least one of the very exceeding things about it, is that it buys deniability for tools are misused. So I can't think of an example right now, but a subjective wellbeing scholar might say, although they don't, that well, we never meant this to be an objective public policy. We just meant to study it empirically. We think, drawing on Max Weber's work, that this doesn't really live up to the responsibility of a social scientist to study concepts that are meaningful to citizens and to the social. So the second thing you could do then would be to assume full responsibility for making the value judgment. This is implicit in calls for what's called conceptual engineering in science. So this is there's a lot of proposals in the wellbeing space for philosophers who are deemed to have more than usual expertise in evaluating issues to work with psychologists who are deemed to have relatively more experience in kind of statistical matters and that sort of thing, to work together to develop these thick concepts. And so these will be normatively sensitive, so they'll be aware of a lot of the evaluative issues and they'll try to work through them, but they still keep everything sort of in-house as it were, technical experts and academics. It's a lot faster and simpler and convenient than doing co-production, and it also means that your science can, in a sense, operate according to scientific standards and doesn't really have to kind of get its hands dirty with broader questions of legitimacy. But one of the big problems with it, we think, is that it really monopolizes expertise about all things evaluative. So I have a lot of arguments with philosophers about their views on what well-being is. I don't think that they really know what they're talking about. But in this system, they would try to exclude me. So there's an idea that the knowledge about evaluative things, particularly things like well-being and justice and that sort of stuff, is distributed. So we should try to tap into that distributed knowledge. So moving on to our third option about legitimacy, we think there's kind of 2 ways to do this. So you can do it by the letter, which we're obviously a bit derisive towards, where you kind of design surveys that let stakeholders make their value judgments via self-reports. And the most prominent case of this is life satisfaction scales, where you say, how satisfied are you with your life as a whole on a scale from 1 to 10, something like that. And then the argument goes that the citizen themselves makes various value judgments about what's important to them in their life, and then packages them up for you in a number. Now, I think this is totally glib, because what you then do is you put it into a regression, and the expert populates what's on the right-hand side of that regression, and then the weights that are actually used in policy come out of those statistical analyses, not out of what people say they care about. But in any case, that's the sort of by the letter approach. And then the by the spirit approach, we think, would include your stakeholders in the process of co-production. There are various ways that you can do that, but I think Some might seem better than others from a sort of legitimacy or an ethical point of view, but I think you really need to consider logistics. So if you're designing like something for the Office of National Statistics, then you're not going to be able to really do like deliberative democracy exercises, and like kind of wide scale citizen consultations are probably a bit more viable. Elections would also be an example, but the type we're talking about here is really small scale co-production stuff. So what do we mean by co-production? We mean an arrangement for sharing power and responsibility among stakeholders in the process of defining these thick concepts and developing their measures. So this arrangement requires, we think, recognizing that there are these different sources of expertise. So very loosely, or very crudely, I guess, you can think of members of the public or your stakeholders as having lived expertise, and particularly expertise about the value judgments that you want to center in whatever it is that you're doing. Then you have the service providers or the policymakers or the bureaucrats, whatever it might be in your particular context you're working with. They're bringing professional or practical expertise. You really want to make sure that whatever you come up with can actually be used. So a classic problem for philosophy is that it's never, real world applicability is minimal. So these people are going to help you with that. And then your technical expertise comes from your academics or similar types, and they're going to help you with sort of your rigor, like whether your statistical measures are statistically valid, whether your theories are logically coherent, this kind of stuff. So we applied this co-production method with this digital charity Turn to Us. But just before I get to that, one point I want to make, because I'm not sure if I make it later, I really don't want to forget it, is that a key point of co-production is that you are not just like letting citizens chat to themselves and then getting their value judgments and plugging them into your model. Everyone is involved in this kind of two-way learning process, so you can push back on each other. So a simple example to wrap your head around this is that in a lot of localism stuff, all you end up with is these local groups that are very niche to development. And that can often shoot them in the foot. So if you have representatives from the government there being like, well, I have all these other constituents who need somewhere to live, you have all these experts there being like, well, actually, I'm not going to be swamped by migrants, but let me think of a way to how we could work through your concerns, like you're worried about Nero taking over the local cafe and restructuring and something like that. How can we explore these kind of options? If you have a genuine dialogue like that, where everyone pushes back on everyone's point of views, and you're genuinely open-minded, open-hearted, and you can learn from each other, then I think you end up with much more sophisticated outcomes than you might in other cases. So we've been doing this kind of work with this charity, Turn to Us. They're a national charity, but they're entirely digital. They have a whole lot of different things where this theory of thriving is relevant to what they do. But I guess the main ones for us are the benefits calculator, which is this tool where you go online, you punch in all your welfare relevant details, like your income, your wealth, how many kids you have, how much your house is worth, and it tells you what entitlements you have access to. It takes you through the government website, it often pre-fills a lot of the forms for you, and then Turn to Us will also often provide assistance for you to backclaim things that you were entitled to previously. The other big one is that Turn to Us gives a lot of grants. So they're quite large grants relative to other organisations of about £1,000, and you can apply for them if you've had a life-changing event that's put you at risk of financial hardship. So those are the two main ones. And we need a theory of thriving to inform their work, because they want to not just help people survive, which is what most of them are doing, but to actually help people thrive. All right, so we had these three expert groups that I've already talked about, and we got them all together. So there were academic experts from Cambridge, professional experts from the charity, and then lived experts who were people who had personal experience with this financial hardship and personal experience of working with Turn to Us. And then this is the process we went through, which I'll go through pretty quickly. So at the first stage, in order to get some representativeness and some sort of initial steer, we emailed everyone on the Turn to Us newsletter, which hits about 5,000 people. We got 5,000 responses. We got 1,500 responses from 5,000 people. Just asking some really simple questions about, like, we had some open-ended questions. What does well-being mean to you? What do people misunderstand about your thriving? What are the main obstacles to your thriving? And then we also had some questions like, of these 5 domains, like health, family, community, job, and life satisfaction, what's the most important to you? Please rank these. So we just got an initial steer to make sure that we weren't going off completely on the wrong paddock. Then we had this working group, which is 4 lived experts, 3 academics, and about 5 or 7, 6 people from Turn to Us, and we met regularly and interviewed each other one-on-one, took a lot of qualitative data out of that, analysed that qualitative data and tried to produce an initial theory of thriving, which we then took to this workshop. So once the lived experts, once everyone in the working group was satisfied with that theory, we then organised a workshop where we got another 10 lived experts in, where we tried to get some demographics that we didn't feel we represented well, like young people, migrants, trans people, a bunch of stuff like that, into that workshop. They gave us further commentary. That was more of a typical thing. So we had breakout rooms, we pre and post surveyed people to ask them whether they felt that the report reflected their feelings, whether they thought that they could express themselves well in the session, that they were listened to, that they learned things, stuff like that. And then at the end of the workshop, we then had a new report, which is getting launched at the end of this month. It's all kind of high gloss and everything. And we're going to put that again to the online survey to get 100% or decent. So do you think this is like a reasonable theory of thriving that reflects your experience? This is just the working group to give you a sense for it. And just very briefly on the kind of theory that we came out with. So some of the themes were very familiar to academics who work on wellbeing, things like freedom and autonomy, having your basic needs met, cultural expectations, and relationships. But then some things really came out that were quite unique to the context. And I think this is where co-production is really powerful, is that you can identify these very peculiar things that are quite relevant in whatever specific situation you're working in. So just repeatedly emphasize that having advocates who would help you navigate the welfare system was really important. Avoiding marginalization and oppression, like relationships was the #1 theme, but I would say that the main trope that came out for me as a privileged white boy was that almost everyone who was in a really bad way, it had somehow originated in like a breakdown in their family relationships because they got into queer relationships or started dating people with the wrong race or whatever it might be, or because of mental health issues. So the model that we came out with was roughly this. So we have this nice metaphor of the tree. We took a long time to come up with the metaphor, but basically you have the means, process, and outcomes. So the means is the things, the resources broadly defined that you leverage in order to thrive. So we have practical means like income and housing, and then we have justice-focused means, which is the soil in which the tree sits, which is that enfranchisement and freedom from oppression. But then even once you've got those means, you're not necessarily thriving because you don't know what to do with them, right? You might go off and do the wrong job or whatever. So we want to think instead about the process of developing self-knowledge. So you can identify the things that you're intrinsically motivated towards that you value. And once you discover those things, that's when you're going to thrive. And then we have the outcomes, which are the things that indicate to you that you're thriving. So you have these relationships that you really care about, you feel autonomous, you feel like you're doing the things that you want to do, you feel competent, and you feel a sense of meaning and purpose. Almost nobody said pleasure or happiness. It's really struck me. I thought that was quite powerful. Okay, so while the academic theories of wellbeing did quite well, academic measures did not, and this was another case where this co-production was very powerful, was that the charity really emphasized repeatedly, and so did some of the experts, that having too many questions is really a barrier to help. People coming are in a desperate circumstance, they already have to answer a lot of questions about their financial situation. If you bombard them with various wellbeing questions, you turn off and leave. And so that rules out nearly all the major measures in academic wellbeing studies, except for life satisfaction scales. And I won't go into what adaptive preferences are, but they're one of the most kind of original, powerful arguments for not using life satisfaction scales, and they came out very prominently in these views. So we really don't think they're working. And then different parts of the organisation have different needs. So now we're designing these bespoke measures for them based on what things organically emerge as applications of this work. My last slide. So how can you scale this up? So whenever we present this to policymakers or people in Treasury in particular, they're always like, well, this is cute, but like you could never do it. And I think that's nonsense. It would just take a long time. So meanwhile, we can do other stuff. But what we propose is essentially that you have to repeat this process at a range of different nodes of policy making. So you can think of nodes like national parks, welfare policy, climate policy, whatever. You can think of it geographically, like local government areas, that sort of thing. And you can think of it as adjacent policy areas. So the next stage in our work will be working with term to us as sectoral partners, so charities that work with homelessness, debt, substance abuse, that sort of thing, to develop their own individual theories. And then we will get them all together in a further round of co-production. And then we will develop a theory of thriving that works for all of them. It will be a bit more abstract, but also a bit more scalable. And then we'll do it at an even higher level where we get government representatives in and start to do it for social policy. And this way, I think we get a bottom-up way of doing wellbeing public policy, where you have very high levels of detail at the lowest scale, and it gradually gets more generalized. All right, thanks very much for listening. Is for
We're going to move online to Riana Betzler, who is going to present a paper called Empathy in Medicine, What is it fit for?
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm just going to start sharing my screen. I really enjoyed the two talks that went before me in this panel. I think that I'll have a lot of commonality with what everyone has had to say so far, and I'm really happy to be speaking to this Cambridge audience as well. So, okay, so today I'm going to be talking about empathy in medicine, which is this project that I've been working on for quite a while now, and thinking a little bit more clearly about trying to figure out exactly what it's good for, what its limits and powers might be within the medical context. And as I was just saying, I think this has a lot in common with what the other speakers so far has said. So I'm really looking forward to discussion and finding connections between the three talks. Okay, so one of the central questions that a lot of researchers have been concerned with, especially in the recent literature, is this question of whether empathy is good or bad for medical practice and or training. And they do tend to dichotomize and kind of make these overarching claims about either it's very good for medical practice or it's very bad for medical practice. So I'll start off by just giving you a sense of what the lay of the land kind of looks like here. So the sort of consensus view is the idea that empathy is a good thing for medical practice. I think this is the assumption that many of us would make, and also that it's important within medical training practices. So we should be trying to train medical students to become more empathic. And within this kind of assumption, there's a lot of literature that seems to support the idea that it's good for everyone within medical practice. It's good for both patients and physicians. We see lots of examples of this kind of thing coming up across various different medical contexts, especially in the Anglo-American world. So the Association of American Medical Colleges has within their sort of guidelines this idea that physicians must be compassionate and empathetic in caring for their patients. The Cambridge Calgary Guide, which is one of the guides that's often used in medical training around the world, but especially in the UK, also has kinds of aim to develop empathy. So I think this little circle's in not quite the right place. Not sure what happened there, but it says uses empathy to communicate understanding and appreciation of clients' feelings or situation, overtly acknowledges clients' views and feelings. So this is one of the things that the Cambridge Calgary Guide is aiming to develop. And this is used, as I said, in the UK, as well as in various other countries. And when we think about trying to recruit doctors into medicine, up and coming doctors, often there is an effort to try to assess the potential candidate's empathy. So one of my friends who works at McGill sent me this screenshot of the application process for Canadian medical schools, where you have to go and upload your letter. But when you're doing that, you also have to answer these specific questions about the candidate's empathy. So please rate the applicant on empathy. And here they actually specify what they mean a little bit more by empathy: gathering and taking the perspective of others relative to peers. We'll notice that many of the other contexts don't necessarily give that clear of a specification, and that's one of the issues that I'll talk about today. And then we also see that they ask, please provide any additional feedback that you have about this applicant's empathy, and whenever applicable, provide examples. So they're really asking you to speak to the candidate's empathy. And this is something that medical schools are kind of trying to really recruit for, especially given that you have at least in the US and in the North American context, a lot of emphasis on testing, which the worry there is that it may be recruiting for the wrong sorts of skills for actually engaging with patients in a good way. So there's been a lot of kind of hype about empathy. And there's also been a lot of research that tries to look at the evidence for this, to do even randomized control trials involving empathy, and to see what the outcomes are of having empathic care. So Jeremy Howick over at Oxford is one of the main people who's doing this kind of work. This kind of work makes all sorts of claims about the benefits of empathy, including that it improves lung function, reduces the length of hospital stay, increases patient satisfaction and quality of life. It even reduces the duration of the common cold. And then it also has all these kind of interpersonal effects. So improving communication and decision-making, reducing burnout, lowering malpractice risk, and increasing treatment adherence. So it seems like there's lots of benefits to empathy, and we'll talk about how we should kind of evaluate this data and what exactly these people are talking about in just a second. If you would like to look into this further, you can see Jeremy Howick's work for recent reviews and meta-analyses. Okay, so the overarching assumption is that empathy is a good thing. I think that's true within medicine and also within our wider society. People often talk about the importance of empathy, but there are a couple of very prominent scholars, especially coming from psychology, neuroscience, and empirically informed moral psychology, who have argued that empathy is actually, on the one hand, not necessary for morality, and that it's actively detrimental on the kind of stronger version to moral ends. And here they're talking about morality within moral psychology, so in a bit of a different context, but many of the examples that they use and many of their concerns, especially for the strong version of this case made by Paul Bloom, is also about the medical context. So here we have this big question about whether empathy should play any role at all within something like ethical medical practice. And I'm going to start trying to gain a bit more traction on that within this talk. Okay, so what exactly is the worry about empathy? And again, we have this kind of issue of what we mean by empathy that's floating around in the background, and I will address that in the next section of this talk. But for now, just bear with me. The first worry about empathy is that it is partial and parochial, so that it's biased in various different sorts of ways. The worry here is basically that we are much more likely to feel empathy towards people who are near to us, sort of within close proximity, within our communities, within our nations, who are similar to us, so who have some of the same sorts of characteristics, whether those are racial or gender characteristics, in terms of thinking about in-group and out-group bias, or whether there are other characteristics like that we have similar interests or something like that. And basically the worry here is that empathy is inherently susceptible to some of the worst of our psychological biases that social psychologists are constantly thinking about. And we can think about how we see this kind of thing happening within contemporary discourse about COVID-19 and vaccine distribution. So the worry that these anti-empathy theorists will say is that if we use an empathic approach to think about vaccine distribution, we are going to think about just distributing those vaccines to those who are within our local communities or within our nation. So keep all of the vaccines for Americans, don't distribute them to the developing world because we care more for Americans. That even further than that, we're going to end up with the racial and gender biases kind of coming into this too in terms of distribution, caring more for the communities that say policymakers are more in contact with rather than communities that already experience various forms of injustice and that are experiencing the full brunt of the racial and ethnic disparities in COVID-19. So the worry here is that an empathic policy is just going to lead to further entrenchment of racial and ethnic disparities and global disparities in the distribution of healthcare resources, because empathy is inherently partial and parochial and can't kind of overcome those sorts of things. And the claims here are largely based upon both the psychological research and these sorts of compelling examples. Another worry is that kind of related to the first one, but a bit different. So here the worry is that empathy inherently has this spotlighting effect. So it targets a single individual, perhaps a very small group of closely related individuals, rather than a kind of wider community. And this leads us to favor interventions that are not necessary, are potentially going to help that like one person, pour a ton of resources into helping that one person or that one very small community at the expense of interventions that might have a bigger impact on more people. So the example from medicine that people often give is that people often like to give a lot of money to very cute children with serious illnesses. And charities know this. They kind of make good use of this kind of identifiable victim effect, as it's sometimes known within the wider bioethics and medical literature. So we can see that the Rally Foundation, which is a nonprofit in the US that deals with childhood cancer, often kind of spotlights an individual kid. So we've got Rally Kid Addie here, who's diagnosed with stage 4 neuroblastoma, and she's very cute. And this is a very effective strategy for kind of getting people to give to the charity and give to that individual community. The worry that the anti-empathy theorists say is basically that there are lots of interventions that are less flashy or that are less kind of exciting, or that are happening in farther out communities that may really help and save lots more people. So one of the key examples here is malaria nets and trying to distribute those to wider communities. So the worry is kind of here a utilitarian sort of one. We're helping the one over the many, and empathy is leading us to do that. And the third main worry about empathy is just that it's totally exhausting. And so this one's a bit different from the others, but the idea here is that empathy just involves a lot of work. When we go in and try to feel and understand, these researchers will see have a more sort of feeling oriented view of empathy. But when we go in and we try to constantly engage with the emotional burden that lots of other people have, it can just overwhelm us and lead to things like burnout in physicians. So the work on burnout is very interesting because it pulls into opposite directions, and we'll see a little bit about why that is. But some researchers say that empathy leads to burnout. Others say that it alleviates burnout for exactly these sorts of reasons about it being exhausting. So there are a couple of considerations about this literature that I'm working on now that we don't really have time to talk through. A lot of these researchers make the assumption that these problems are inherent to empathy rather than things that are about other factors such as the systemic issues or things like other sorts of psychological capacities or other cognitive biases that we might have. They kind of blame empathy for all of this. It's not clear to me that we should be doing that. And they also say that other capacities are absolutely fine, things like compassion and concern, but it's also not clear that they overcome them. We don't have time to get into that, but feel free to ask me in the Q&A. Okay, so now I'm going to kind of deal with the issue of what empathy is, which is this big question that's been floating around in the background. So so I'm going to kind of talk about this issue of what empathy is, because this has been floating around in the background, and I think it's really important for trying to diagnose the situation of why we're getting these really conflicting views about whether empathy is good or bad. And the basic problem here is that within both the pro and the anti-empathy sides, we have a number of different constructs and measures across the board. So people are talking about very different things when they're talking about empathy. They're often not very specific about what they mean by empathy, especially when they are in kind of more public facing sorts of roles, the kinds of things that we looked at for the medical education purposes. They don't necessarily specify what exactly they mean by empathy. And some of the constructs that they're using, just to give you a sense of the variation here, include emotional empathy, which is really about feeling what the other individuals feel. So the anti-empathy theorists are very much focused on just this purely emotional based form of empathy, where it is feeling what the other person feels. And this can come about through a process of either imagining what the other person's situation might be like and then simulating, or it can come through a form of kind of contagion. So this is the kind of thing where if you walk into the library during finals period, you might find yourself feeling stressed, even if you were not stressed when you have nothing stressful happening in your life. And this is the idea that you just pick up on other people's emotions. So we have this kind of emotional view of empathy. We have cognitive empathy, which is the other main division within this field, and that's about understanding the thoughts and the feelings and the beliefs and desires of other individuals. But to do that, even to understand the feelings, you don't necessarily need to use a feeling route on this kind of view. You can just use a kind of cold cognitive route to gaining that understanding. This is often called theory of mind. And then we have issues like concern or compassion, which are defined in various different ways. Care, some of these measures also engage with ideas about care. And then within the pro-empathy literature, you often have even some of this work is focused on just positivity, positive communication. How optimistic is your doctor about the prognosis and what impact does that have on your outcomes? And you also have kind of even like placebo effects, just kind of disconnected from empathy, being used as lumping together to form this idea of the positivity of empathy. So there's this worry that not everyone's talking about the same thing, and people aren't being particularly careful within this field about what they're talking about. And there's sometimes a sense within this literature that if we just kind of do more experiments, especially kind of coming from the neuroscientists and psychologists, we'll be able to really figure out the distinctions between things like emotional empathy, cognitive empathy, and compassion. And the neuroscience is like forming a big part of this literature. But it's not clear to me, and I've kind of argued this elsewhere, that is going to help. I think that the kind of empirical literature and the concepts are in this reciprocal relationship with one another, and just having more empirical data isn't going to solve the problem. So we need to take a different approach. So looking more closely at the two main kind of positions within medicine that we've been talking about so far, what exactly are the concepts of empathy that we tend to find? As I've already said, for the anti-empathy theorists, the worry is really just about emotional empathy. And these theorists try to isolate this from other capacities, and they use the neuroscientific literature to try to kind of bolster that idea. Empathy is seen here as a capacity, and this capacity for feeling what one takes another individual to be feeling, disconnected from concern, compassion, anything that might follow on from that, and also disconnected from cognitive empathy. And the worry that I have with this kind of definition is that if we look at where this emerged from historically and also within the contemporary literature, it's really based off of an operational definition. So when these researchers want to go in and construct measures of empathy, especially using things like questionnaire measures in social psychology and also the social and affective neuroscientific measures, they need to come up with these very narrow definitions and try to pull apart the differences between these capacities. That's part of their aim. But when these researchers are making these normative claims about the value of empathy, they're forgetting that what they've done is basically what Mark Fabian was saying about just creating these very technical operationalized definitions, and they're extrapolating from the evidence about a very narrow kind of operationalized technical term to broader values within society. And I think that this inference is unwarranted. So the worry there is kind of about being the wrong level of analysis. For the pro-empathy theorists, I think there's two issues going on. One is the tendency to kind of lump together lots of seemingly related constructs. And I think that combining different constructs into an overarching theory of empathy is not necessarily a bad thing, so long as we keep track of why we're doing that and what the components are doing. But here they're just kind of lumping together a bunch of evidence about placebo effects, about positivity, about cognitive empathy, and about emotional empathy to try to make their case for it in a kind of uncontrolled and unregulated way. They also tend to, in the medical case, sometimes put forward a more cognitive view of empathy. And I think the more cognitive views of empathy have some similar problems to the purely emotional forms. It's not clear to me that this is the right level of analysis. This is done less work on this one, but I think it's going to run into some of the same sorts of problems as the isolated emotional sort of view. Okay, so how are we going to move forward given that we've identified some of these problems? I've been very much inspired by the work on well-being that Anna Alexandrova and her colleagues have been doing. So I think that recognizing the theoretical, historical, and sociological factors that drive the formulation of some of these constructs and the limitations of them is really important. And then that we need to formulate and adopt concepts and constructs that are value apt for a particular project within a particular domain, where that domain is going to be quite narrow. So much narrower than just saying good for medicine or bad for medicine. Good for what within medicine is kind of the questions that we need to be asking. And I think Mark Fabian's talk did a great job of thinking about how exactly we might do this. So I'm looking forward to talking further. Just to give another kind of conceptual worry here before my final kind of concluding section, where I'll try to say what that finer grained work might look like in the case of empathy. Another worry that I have in particular about the anti-empathy views is that they have this extremely narrow sense of what we mean when we're talking about morality. So they'll try to say things like, well, I just mean that empathy is bad for morality or moral cognition. But when you look at what they're actually saying, by that, what they mean is basically a kind of utilitarian cost benefit analysis form of morality. And it's very much purely supposed to be about fairness and justice considerations. So people like Paul Bloom try to separate out the moral domain from the interpersonal domain. And he'll say things like, well, for interpersonal things, it might be okay, but, and he means a purely emotional sense. But for moral things, it's not good. But it's not clear to me that we should be adopting that sort of distinction at all. I actually disagree with kind of separating the moral from the interpersonal in that way. I think the pro-empathy theorists are less guilty of this sort of thing. Okay, so what is empathy good for? How might we start to make progress on this kind of question? Well, when we look at this sort of question, I think, again, we need to start thinking about what we mean by empathy in a more value apt sort of way. And I think that doing so is going to involve thinking about how these different narrow constructs and concepts combine with one another in the real world outside of the lab. And that's a kind of complicated project of integration. But just as a couple of examples of some definitions that are kind of starting to sort of combine these. I think one of them is just the everyday definition that we might find in something like a dictionary. So here we have the action of understanding, being aware of, being sensitive to, and vicariously experiencing the feelings, thoughts, and experience of another, of either the past or present, without having the feelings, thoughts, and experience fully communicated in an objectively explicit manner, also the capacity for this. So there's a lot going on in this definition, and I think that we need to more tightly specify them for particular domains. But I think it kind of captures how there's a dynamic interrelationship between the understanding, the cognitive elements of empathy, and the emotional empathy elements, and that they can kind of come together in a fluid and dynamic sort of way. I also work on Carl Rogers and his philosophy, his ideas about psychotherapy, and he has this really that fascinating and lovely definition of empathy, where it's to sense the client's world as if it were your own, but without ever losing the as if quality. That is empathy, and this seems essential to therapy. To sense the client's anger, fear, or confusion as if it were your own, yet without your own anger, fear, or confusion getting bound up in it, is the condition we are endeavoring to describe. When the client's world is this clear to the therapist and he moves about in it freely, then he can both communicate his understanding of what is clearly known to the client, and he can also voice meanings in the client's experience of which the client is scarcely aware. So this is a very kind of high level and skilled view of empathy, but it does kind of take as part of it the emotional and the cognitive sides in a kind of dynamic interrelationship with one another. It's highly regulated. So the clinician is going to experience the feelings, but the feelings aren't going to kind of just take over. They're not in this kind of immediate overwhelm of feeling, and it involves a lot of emotional regulation, I think, to be able to do this well. So these are some examples of kind of ways that we might start to think about how these capacities combine with one another. And then we can think about within particular contexts. So we had two main ones kind of coming up in the earlier part of the talk. The first is about distribution of resources. So here I think we can say a couple of things. One is that if we're understanding empathy in this purely emotional sense, which I don't think is the right way to understand it for medicine, it's clearly not going to be good for this kind of distribution of resource problem. It's going to be susceptible to all of the sorts of problems that psychologists and neuroscientists say that it has. So that is kind of just sort of clear from this. But if we kind of move away from that purely emotional sense and we try to understand it as involving this dynamic interrelation between the emotional and the cognitive, I might be able to play some role here. I think that perhaps when we are policymakers, we don't necessarily want to prioritize the purely emotional pull of our heartstrings, but that kind of thinking about this cognitive and emotional form may be important for trying to understand what various communities are going through and using this as input for our cost-benefit analyses and for thinking about how to distribute resources effectively. So in particular here, I'm thinking about the idea that empathy construed in this more nuanced way might be able to provide some kind of epistemic input for the ethical deliberation about distribution of resources. And we can see examples of this from kind of thinking about community mental health care. And I'm happy to talk about that further in the Q&A. Okay, another context where we might think about the role of empathy is in the doctor-patient relationship. So here we can think about what exactly the worries about empathy and what the limits might be. So I think here the worries about bias definitely still stand, and we see this well documented in issues about connecting and communicating with women and people of color within the clinic. And here I think that we can think about that empathy, whether understood in the nuanced or the kind of narrow ways, might have some limits, but the important questions to be asking are how do we try to overcome those limits by using things like systems level interventions or exposure to narratives to try to overcome some of those things. I think there's some promising work that shows that we might be able to do that. This kind of context removes any worries about the spotlighting, because part of the point is that you are engaging with a single individual. But the concerns about burnout, again, might still stand, but similar sort of worry as similar sort of response as in the first case about bias. I think here we need to think about what the limitations are. They may be very real in the case of even more nuanced forms of empathy, but there may be some ways of overcoming them, and understanding what the different elements contribute might help us to do that. So that is basically it for me. The kind of conclusions, the main takeaways from this talk are here, and I'll leave you to have a look at those if you'd like.
Thank you so much for that very stimulating conversation.